and welcome to the Kansas City Young Adult BSF podcast. My name is Connor Moylan.
And I'm Marisa Moylan.
And we are the teaching staff at the Kansas City Young Adult BSF class. Our goal this year is to make Jesus known as we read the Gospel of John. And the podcast is a space where we can talk about things that didn't quite fit into the lecture for time purposes or just would have taken us down a rabbit trail that is fun to explore but not necessarily pertinent to explore for what we were talking about in class. So this is where we do that. So this week we are going over lesson 12 and talking about John 8.
Yep. So if you read John 8 and you read out of an NIV Bible, but I think most Bibles, it says, well, in mine it said, the earliest manuscripts and many other ancient witnesses do not have John 7:53 through 8:11. So Connor.
Marisa.
BSF gave us a very condensed that they know that this wasn't included in old biblical manuscripts, that this is probably a story that was shared, but it was not originally a part of John's gospel, but we still covered it. And it's a story, it's the woman caught in adultery. I mean, that's a story that is very popular.
Yep.
A lot of people use that. A lot of people teach on it.
Yep.
It can be used as a weapon against women. It's just great. So I guess a couple questions. Why was it included in the Bible late? And maybe you don't have that answer, but maybe you have an idea. And then why do we teach about it? Why? I mean, you taught about it. I mean, your lecture catapulted us in.
Yeah.
I see the connection of Jesus is the light. I get that. But I'm but why? Why did it put in there?
Well, one, we don't know that it put in there. I mean, part of it is, we don't have the original text of the Gospel of John. Even the stuff we're looking at is from an older time period. So the manuscript stuff is an art, not a science. Or it's both, maybe. That's probably insulting to someone who does that for a living. We've talked about manuscripts on this podcast. But there is some, we're not going to say for certainty that it was not. But I think the best evidence that we have now points to that this was a later addition to the Bible.
Okay.
So what we do have is we have evidence of people talking about this story orally, the early church fathers, before the Bible.
Okay.
Before the New Testament is set up. People are discussing this story.
Okay.
We talk about Jesus. So there is evidence, I think, that this happened. Because the first, things would have been written down, but the first things was all oral tradition of these stories getting passed around. So I think the reason, I don't know why BSF chose to go over it, but I think part of it is, like they mentioned, this seems to be a genuine story of Jesus, and I think we're trusting in, I felt moved, we pray before writing these lectures and try to follow where the Spirit is guiding, and I was trusting that this is what God wanted me to write in the lecture, and we're covering as a class, and so we're, we either have a God who's sovereign or who isn't.
Yeah.
So we don't know. So I guess the prevailing evidence, the main story is that this is a story that got passed around and was an important story, probably for a long time. And someone who was copying down, the text thought it was important so that the story be preserved. And so they put it in the Bible.
Okay.
That's, I think, would be
kind of the pools, the note.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe. It could have started as a side note. It could have been someone. Yeah, we don't know.
Okay.
And also we didn't have access to a lot of these manuscripts until recently in history for 200 years. The manuscripts of the King James Bible is based off of almost all of them have this story.
Okay.
So this is a relatively, in the history of Christianity, most people have thought this was part of their Bible.
Okay.
So
what caused people to think that it wasn't a part of their Bible? What triggered that?
Well, as we've done more archaeology, one, there is some controversy around it going back in times because there were still some where it wasn't included.
Okay.
But the dominant narrative was, and then, do you know who Augustine is?
Yes.
So Augustine was talking about it, and he said, back in the day, And he said the reason that this was not included, and some people still hold to this view, is the reason it wasn't included in old manuscripts is because adultery was a really serious offense.
Okay.
And I think there's some insinuation that people were like offended by the amount of the scandalous grace that Jesus has.
Got it.
So they're like, no, they took it out of some of these manuscripts because like they couldn't handle it.
Got it.
And that's what Augustine sort of says and challenges people when he was teaching over this in one of his sermons.
Okay.
Of like, no, this is what Jesus was like. Like, you can't take this out.
Got it.
So I think the defenders of it still being in there, they would say the reason it's not in these early manuscripts is because somebody early on got spooked and took it out.
Okay.
And then, but other manuscripts survived that it was in there. I think it was only somewhat related to the question you asked me, but what else do you remember?
I asked you, you broached it. And I feel like I kind of brought it in too, that I feel like the reason why BSF covers this, which we know churches who have not covered this when they've studied John, that because it directly correlates and shows that light, which Jesus does proclaim that he is the light of the world later on in this passage.
Yeah, and I think it just is, I think this is when we talk about scripture being inerrant or having not errors or being fully trustworthy, we have to remember that there's what we've got isn't the pure perfect form of it anymore when we talk about it. And so we have to hold these things in tension of being man, let's just say the best evidence was this shouldn't be part of a Bible. That means people were reading the Bible for over 1,000 years and had a part of it that technically shouldn't have been in there.
Yeah.
So part of it is because the archaeology has gotten so much better in the past couple hundred years.
Okay.
And we found things. Which has led to people re-examining, looking at this, but also for I trust God, and that if this isn't supposed, I don't know, it's His plan, and I think what's interesting is these things that are included, the amount of, this is one of the, we talk about the glaring examples of when there's discrepancies to point them out, but most of the Bible, most of the manuscripts all agree on just about everything. And when you look at different manuscripts, the things that are changed, no doctrine is changed or anything like that. So I think, that helps me trust in the story we have. And, because sometimes when you look at this, if you think about it for a long time, or at least for me, it can make you just nervous of well, what else did some scribes stick in there? But the evidence we have for this being preserved is really incredible in so many of these few. And having a little note in there about the angels is different than a whole story being put in there.
Yeah.
Or at least feels different to me.
Yeah. Well, and the thing too is it's not changing Jesus's deity. It's not looking at doctrine. It's literally just showing the grace and showing the discrepancy that the Pharisees knew that they were sinners.
Yeah.
Even though they still chose to come after Jesus.
Yeah. And Jesus forgives a lot of people. So, but I don't know. I love the story. Our church chose not to teach over it, and they had a very understandable reason why, and talked about it. And when they went through the Gospel of John, and it seems like a very defensible position, but also teaching on it and putting in the caveat also seems like a defensible position. And you just trust in the Spirit, and so that's been guiding the church. So that's kind of where I land on it. What about you?
Yeah, I don't know where I land on it. I think when I think about this story, I think about hearing other people's testimonies and seeing what they walk through, and how those can be so powerful to me. But it doesn't change the deity of God. It doesn't changes the doctrine that we hold to, and it doesn't change overarching our theology. So knowing that I kind of see it almost like that. I listen to a podcast that's all about people's their testimony and their story and how God worked through them, but they're not changing my belief in Jesus. If there's things sometimes there's things where I'm there was a Jewish individual that converted Christianity, and she had some weird doctrinal things that I was I don't know if I agree with that. But she was still in the process of figuring out her own faith, and so but that didn't change just because I listened.
Yeah. So
I think that reading it in that sense and maybe understanding it that way is helpful. So I think it's really interesting because I feel this story is I have went to multiple Easter services that they use this story to portray, and so I don't know, I just think it's interesting.
Yeah, no, I do too. So, but I mean, either way, I think the stories bore a lot of fruit.
Yeah.
You know, and I think that's clear. But also, like, if it shouldn't be in there, I think we respect that, and it can still be, included somewhere else or passed down as a legitimate story of Jesus. That's just not scripture, and that's okay.
Yep.
So.
I mean, and there's lots of other like books that weren't included.
Yep.
That can be the same way.
Yeah. And there's still things we can learn from them, even if I think they're good, even if it's not scripture.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
What else do you want to talk about? This was your lecture.
This was my lecture. So we talked in the last podcast about the Feast of Tabernacles, booths, different things, shelters, just everything going on. So the light of the world also comes from this festival.
Okay.
So one of the things they did is they lit these giant lamps, like these giant lamps in the court that like were so big and so bright and like tall. They're supposed to like light up like most of the city at night.
You talked about that.
Yep. And there was like singing and dancing and different things like that. But the lamps were, how we talked about last time, the water symbolized like a good harbor or something like that.
Yeah.
The lamps symbolized like the messianic promise that the Messiah would come to be the light to the world. That's like literally what they're alluding to. And so like, this is like, Jesus is talking about this as even like more explicit. Like the promise of the Messiah is to be the light to the world.
Laugh at them, but
no, I know, but like, but Jesus, I think this also maybe shows why the Pharisees get so upset and the people get so upset in discussion, because it is like,
well, Jesus gets upset too, because he's like, don't you listen to me?
I mean, it can't be more explicit of like the thing that this lamp, these lights are pointing to about being a light to the world, to being in the messianic hope for the people of Israel, and then going out for all the Gentiles. That's me. Yes.
Yeah.
So.
That background is like really important to know and think about, and stuff that like we like wouldn't think about.
Yep. And like, again, Jesus is something they can physically see, they know, they understand, they can touch with. That's what Jesus is pulling for an example.
All right. Cool.
So that was just one more from that festival.
Yeah. It's Christmas time right now.
Yeah.
Well, it's like going to lead up to Christmas.
Oh, yeah.
And I like have been thinking about like, we've been talking about like Christmas, and Connor and I have young kids, and like what do we do, and Santa and culture and Jesus, and our son's born on Christmas, and it's just like, it's a lot. But I took the boys and we looked at lights today, and our oldest asked like about why do we have lights at Christmas time? And I was like, because it represents Jesus. He's the light of the world. So thanks, PSF. Because I was like, but it was just like reframing my brain of like, okay, like, yes, these things, like, but they used to represent.
Yeah, it used to be more explicit.
It just isn't that way. And so I was just like, oh, okay, cool.
Yeah.
So I guess it's okay that you put our lights on our house too early this year.
Yes. Let's keep them up all year.
No.
But it's a good reminder of like these things, the reason we, I mean, some of these traditions, like the Christmas tree, are actually pre-Christmas. It's
right.
It's from back in the time. But like, images can be reused and repurposed. But like, looking at the things around us and connecting it to God and to Jesus, I think is helpful. It's made me think about this. Reading John's made me think about that more, about the amount of symbolism and using it for teaching, because Jesus he was really into that sort of thinking of like, look at this physical thing, think about it, see how it applies to, the divine.
It's your perspective too. Like, when you think about like Christmas, like what do you think about, and like having that like perspective shift.
Yes. Yeah. Thinking about Jesus and Advent and preparing instead of gifts and Santa and cookies and ugly sweaters and different things like that.
Yeah.
So you guys had a discussion over John 8:28, correct?
Yeah. So John 8:28 reads. So Jesus said, "When you have lifted up the Son of Man, then you will know that I am the one I claim to be, and that I do nothing on my own, but speak just what the Father has taught me." And so I shared that when I read in my study Bible, well, first I wrote ascension, because I feel like lifted up is like which is like I like we don't know what it looked like on Ascension, but like
Sure.
I will when you think it in my head, I see Jesus on this cloud and he like raises up, which is like probably something I watched when I was a child. Like we can just say that. But I read my study Bible because I was like, I just was struggling with it. I was like, well, I don't really, it's significant because he goes home with the father, but like the question that we answered is like, why? And I'm like, I don't know why. Well, then my study Bible says, normally used in the New Testament in the sense of exalt, which I would assume would be ascension, but John uses it of the crucifixion, and which I thought was interesting. And then we further dialogued.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because like, so exalt is like really like kingly royal language of like putting someone on the throne, and so it lifted up has this really interesting double meaning of like, they lifted Jesus up at the cross and like it was this horrible, terrible thing. And they're like mocking him,
right,
with the crown of thorns, the king of the Jews. Like it is like a mock royal ceremony. But like one of our faith of our tenet is like, no, that is actually when Jesus is lifted up and like is, the ascension comes later, but where he goes like back to God or whatever that looks like you said.
Ascended, yeah.
But this is when they're like enthroning him,
right?
Truly, and it's like this, like backwards and upside down. So like, we're reading the moment. This crucifixion is something terrible, but it's something also like glorious. And like, what does it mean to defeat sin and death, to be enthroned? To be royaled. It means like giving up your life. So it's just this really interesting like double meaning that like helps us when we see the cross. To see victory.
Yeah, and seeing it as victory and I think exalting it in that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it was like at the time it would have been even harder to stomach. I remember I wish I could figure out where I saw this, but I was looking at images of different like artifacts and stuff they found from Rome, and they found like early graffiti like mocking the Christians for worshiping this guy who was crucified, because being crucified was so dishonoring in that culture and different things like that.
But it's interesting now that like in a sense like we wear crosses
and
we have tattoos.
We've all reclaimed
it.
Yeah, different thing. We've reclaimed it, but you just like, it's like, it'd be like, in 2,000 years, everyone's like got a picture like a necklace of the electric chair. Or the guillotine or something. Like, that's what we're talking about. Like, maybe
I know.
The guillotine maybe for the French Revolution of like, we don't wear those, or most people don't wear, the guillotine as a tattoo or on your necklace, but that's like, it's like what it was, the power of the state to impose terror. So like, I think it shows that like, it's this like, the cross is the most classic example of you meant this for evil, but God meant it
for good.
And I think that lifted up language, that it's both talking about physically putting him on the cross, but also making him king. It's just like one of those interesting like word plays that John's got going on.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
I'm gonna stay with that for a little bit.
You're not gonna come back with a tattoo of a guillotine on your on your arm?
No, I'm good. Just add it to my sleeve, right?
Add it to your sleeve. So.
Okay. Are you asking the question or am I gonna ask it?
Sure, I will ask.
Okay.
So. We are Chiefs fans over here.
Oh,
we are football fans. Yeah. So at this point of the season, the Chiefs are 8-4. They're coming off a loss.
3-4. I thought they were 8-5.
I believe they're 8-4.
Okay. I thought that this was their 5th loss against Packers.
I thought it was their 4th, but we'll find out.
Okay.
You already know this, and you can look this up, and we'll see.
You're probably wrong.
So, but the Chiefs have a good football team again this year, but it's not quite as good. It doesn't look quite as good as what we've seen. So, Marissa, do you think the Chiefs will win the Super Bowl? Why or why not?
I don't think they will. I don't know if they're even going to make it.
Yeah.
I'm nervous they're not going to make it.
Yeah.
Maybe they'll make it, maybe they'll make it into the playoffs. But, I wonder if it's going to be, the, devastating loss against the Bengals.
Yeah. Yeah. They will probably make it. They will probably make it to the playoffs.
Yeah, selfishly, I'm okay with every other year. If they want to get their stuff together next year and go, that was totally fine.
We're very spoiled as Chiefs fans to have already won 2 Super Bowls.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah, we're
I
very
don't feel,
spoiled.
but like I'm like, oh, this is just normal. The Chiefs losing.
Yeah. Well,
What do you think the Chiefs are going to win the Super Bowl?
of course, this probably doesn't come across because it's so like I'm also history focused on different things like that. But I'm also kind of like a stats guy and a probabilities guy.
And what does stats tell you?
Well, the stats tell you that even the years the Chiefs have won a Super Bowl, they were never better than like a 25 to 30% chance.
Really?
Just because of the vagaries of losing of one game.
Yeah.
If the team is, even if the Chiefs are 70%
They just had some
better,
really bad losses lately.
Yeah, they have. But even if the Chiefs are 70% likely to win, that means they're 30% likely to lose, and just like sometimes that 30% comes up. So the best bet is always say no, they won't win the Super Bowl. The odds are picking against one team. The odds are in your favor.
Okay.
So I'm actually, but on a maybe to be a little less, just obstinate about my answer and be a little more contrarian. I'm not super panicked about the Chiefs yet. I think they actually are just about as good as anybody else. They've got a lot of experience and they still have the best quarterback. And when you have the best quarterback in the NFL, like you always have a chance. You just do. Okay. So I think.
So even though this year has been really hard and Patrick is like struggling to connect with his wide receivers, he is still considered the best quarterback in the NFL? Or is that just your personal preference?
I would think he's considered the best quarterback in the NFL because people who judge like that aren't going to judge. You're going to judge over like a longer time frame.
Okay.
At least that's how I think it's best done. I think the people doing the smartest analysis would agree, and I also think it's a lot of it is like the receivers. A lot of the blame, rightly or wrongly, publicly is on the receivers and not less on Patrick. It is a team. It is a team sport.
I know. I keep on waiting for them to like change something because last year when they were so like criticizing Butker in like all the media and then they switched and he's just been like amazing since. So I'm just like waiting for something to change.
Yeah.
So I'm praying for their psychologists and their counselors
to
get their mental brains in butt and make them catch those balls. And yeah, I'm ready.
You're ready.
I'm ready. Yeah.
Right.
I mean, it hasn't been very fun to watch. It's been so painful.
Yeah, I mean, after years of watching it,
I didn't watch on Sunday. I was like, I'm good.
Yeah.
I slept through half the game.
You did sleep through half the game.
So
all right, there's sports talk from your teaching staff here at BSF. Just what you always wanted. So, thank you all for joining us. We hope that this podcast didn't just inform you about our opinions on the Chiefs, but helped you to go out and make Jesus known in your community. Thank you guys, and have a great rest of your day.